So, welcome, Professor. It's really a great pleasure to share this coffee with you. This is how I've been told by Alessio, that we will be having a coffee together.
Yeah, okay.
But there is no coffee.
Oh, it's very disappointing, I'm afraid. We'll have to do something about this.
Well, and it is indeed a great pleasure to be here with you, and thank you very much for a great hospitality and lovely organization. I have with me today, as we heard, Dr. Vassil Girginov, a professor in sports management and development at Brunel University of London, but also visiting professor at the Russian International Olympic University, the University of Johannesburg, and UQ Leuven. As we heard, you are also president at the European Association of Sport Management. And I would also say from your yesterday's speech and from what we can Google when we Google you, that you are on the speed dial of different sports associations and federations when it comes to the topics of societal sustainability, social impact, legacy. So as we are having a coffee, what would be the key two most memorable experiences you've had that you would like to share with the audiences?
Well, thank you for your introduction. I'm afraid the introduction seems to be longer than the actual presentation, which tells you something about the age of the person, actually. When you start accomplishing a number of accolades, or add a number of accolades to your name, it usually happens at the expense of your age. But it's a very great question, and I can answer this question straight away. Because both personally and professionally, as an academic, I was absolutely fascinated by the relationship that was established between the British Society and the Olympic Games around the London Olympics in 2012. And you will remember that at the time, the head of the president of the World Athletics, Sebastian Coe, was the head of the organizing committee. And although there have been a number of deliberations whether Britain should bid to host the Olympics or not, eventually it got the support of the then Labour government, and they succeeded in winning the bid at their session in Singapore. And you know what was the first thing when Seb Coe and Mike woke up on the next day after the champagne and everything to celebrate? The first thing that they said to each other was, excuse my French, shit, now we have to deliver. So, and this is where the interesting part of my answer of the story comes into the picture. So, the London bid for the Olympics was based not only on a promise that we're going to deliver great games, but what we're going to do for the Olympic movement. So you give us the right to host the event, but what is this we're going to do in order to reciprocate, to enhance the Olympic movement? And to that end, the British government said, okay, folks, we are going to need, I mean, of course, originally they estimated the cost of the games to be around £2 billion. It ended up being £12 billion. And we know the story happens every time. But they said to the society, okay, we're going to invest £10 billion of public money, but in exchange, we're going to deliver 5 substantial promises. We're going to make the country more open, more democratic. We're going to enhance business. We're going to promote voluntarism. We're going to establish a world-class sport system. And that was a promise that was put forward to the society in 2007. And then they realized that the full name of the Games was the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And 2 years later, they published a strategy, a promise for the Paralympic sport. To cut the long story short, and to relate the answer to sustainability, so it was not that the exchange that was established between the state and society, but also they put in place a measuring system, a tool, which was called meta-evaluation. This was for the first time in the history of sport and the Olympic Games when a national government, host government, has committed to monitor very closely the impact the overall impact and the legacy of the Olympic Games. And this was successfully concluded. So to me, this was probably the most interesting part, whereby for the first time in the history of major sporting events, a national government has committed to use sport in order to advance a number of good social causes and to report back to society and to justify the public spending.
And now knowing this, I'm curious to understand what they've done with this data.
Well, this data, of course, was published. It's available freely online. You can Google it. If you just put meta-evaluation of the London Games, you can see the whole document, which is hundreds of pages, but you can scroll through and attend to the specific sections you might be interested in. So, for example, mass participation, or business developments, or environment, whatever this might be. Well, of course, this was a corporate document, although it was developed by academics, including academics, but essentially Grant Thornton consultancy agency led the investigation. There are some very important, valuable lessons. And more importantly, as I hinted in my presentation yesterday, understanding impact of any event, including running events, is a form of public audit, which compares what has been promised before we introduce the event and what was actually delivered. So from that point of view, a very important precedent was set up.
But that's sometimes tricky with the data and a lot of evaluations, because sometimes, and with the legacy, sometimes it stays somewhere at the bookshelves, and we don't see the implementation actually in practice in the following year or in the next decade, etc. So it's important to do a follow-up that is tangible. And when we are speaking about sustainability, nowadays the focus a lot is on the environmental sustainability. Which is even more tangible to measure the impact of the environmental sustainability if you apply it in your organizational processes. But what about societal sustainability? What about the governmental sustainability? How do we shift the focus towards the other elements of sustainability? United Nations have the 2030 global agenda with 17 sustainable development goals. How do we do it for sports?
Well, this indeed is a critical question, and as you rightfully pointed out, I'm afraid that we have been interpreting sustainability we've been using a rather reductionist approach to sustainability, and we tend to look mainly at the environmental dimension of sustainability. And I don't need to tell you that there are 4 pillars to sustainability, including the economic, the environmental, the societal, and the governance dimension of sustainability. And when we put these 4 pillars together, they link or correspond directly with the idea of social impact. The very expression sustainable development is actually made up of 2 parts. The first one is sustainability. So what is this we need to sustain? We all need to answer this question. When we put together running events or any other sporting events, we need to be very clear. What is this we would like to sustain? And what is this we would like to develop? And for those of you who will be familiar actually with the idea of sustainable development, it emerged in order to ameliorate the chaos caused by economic growth and progress. For many, many, many years, our thinking and policies were dominated by economic growth and the gross domestic product. We only tended to use the GDP as a measure of development. And interestingly enough, it was 2 bright minds, one from Pakistan, Al-Haq, and the Amartya Sen from India, who developed the counterpart to economic development, which we now call the Human Development Index, which was developed precisely in order to sensitize us about the moral dimension that we're missing in the whole exercise. The same applies to running events in sport. So we need to answer very clearly what we mean by sustainability. What is this we would like to sustain? And there is a general agreement that there are 3 key elements that we would like to sustain. The first one is nature, which includes the natural environment and the ecosystem. And running events, as my colleague and friend Jordan mentioned earlier, they take place in urban environments and sometimes in the nature. So we absolutely have to make sure that when we intervene with nature, we sustain this nature. We don't really cause any damage or harm to the environment. The second is the life support. The second important element we need to sustain is the life support. And the third, of course, is the community. And more specifically, the institutional dimension and the social capital, which we can expand on. When we look at development and social impact, again, referring to the talk yesterday, impacts are results of visions. And those visions are always developmental. Because we would like to see something develop. For example, we develop people, communities, groups, organizations, a city, economy. It's all about development. And every time we mention the word development, we enter into a relationship whereby it's intentional, whereby one agency sets out to develop the capacity of another agency. If you read any strategy of any sport organization, including the sustainable strategy of World Athletics, this is what you see. Intentions to develop the capacity of national federations, of women in particular. There is a strong emphasis on gender and women. So we need to be very clear, what is this we would like to develop, to sustain and to develop. And I'm afraid this answer is always contextual. You can only provide a meaningful answer if you take the specific context into account. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to come up with.
Which brings me to the point that I had a very interesting actually discussion yesterday here over the coffee, real coffee.
Which we're still lacking.
Where actually we agreed that sometimes for sports organizations who are not yet there when it comes to the sustainability implementation, most of them, sometimes it's important just to start by doing self-assessment, to know where you are when it comes to the any types of the sustainability implementation or change. So that's kind of a reminder, so not only to understand, but also to start self-assessing where you are with getting there where you want to be. So climate change is not anymore a threat, it's a crisis. This is how we like to call it nowadays. However, there are so many emerging crises all around the world. And we saw with the COVID, with the pandemic, that somehow the sustainable development, which was the topic of all the politicians across the industries, also in sports, somehow it was marginalized. How to avoid losing the sustainable development, sustainability as a topic, as a priority topic in case of some other crisis that could pop up. How to avoid, how to make sure that it's still, we're still on the road towards 2030 or whatever is a finish line for the humanity.
I mean, I don't really think that we need the United Nations sustainability goals in order to, as individual organizations or community, to subscribe to this thinking. Because the reason that of any organization is actually to sustain itself. Any business, this is the core idea, the core mission of any business or any organization, to sustain themselves. So in order to do that, you need to develop your capacity. You need to control your growth. You need to be able to obtain and utilize resources. So sustainability should be an inseparable, an essential characteristic of the thinking and the structure of any entity. I don't think that we should refer to sustainability as an outside goal, if you'd like, an external goal that we need to aspire to, and because it was quantified somehow by the United Nations into those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are actually a very good guide. And interestingly enough, if you look at the strategies of many sport organizations, international sport organizations in particular, and the IFC, you will see that they haven't actually subscribed to several of those important sustainable development goals.
And if we have a checklist, for instance, like checklist of 3 key points checkpoints for sports organization, event organizer to cross when doing preparations towards the event? What would be your key checkpoints, basically? When it comes to for instance, you can compare it towards the governmental sustainability or societal sustainability. It doesn't have to be environmental one.
Perhaps the first point is to ask ourselves, or any organization ask themselves, whether they have sustainability on their radar in any shape or form. In any shape or form, because you can use different terms to define sustainability, but any organization should be able to say, yes, we have a clear sense of who we are and where we would like to be, and how we are going to sustain our development. The second one is to have structures and sound structures and process in place, which are absolutely essential for any institution to exist in the first place. And the third one is the governmental dimension, which you have referred to on several occasions. I would like to ask colleagues in the audience, with a show of hands, how many of your events or organizations actually subscribe to the industry standard ISO 20121? Hands up. This is very interesting. The ISO 20121 was the industry standard for event sustainability that was first established in relation to the London Games, and the LOCOG, the organizing committee of the London Games, was the first organization to certify itself to meet this standard. This standard sets out very clear requirements for event organizers, sustainability, environmental requirements. Second question, if I may. How many of your organizations do have a code of good governance or subscribe to some sort of a code of good governance? Well, of course, World Athletics and in India, I believe. Okay. Maybe a couple of organizations. Ask yourself why. Good governance, we can criticize this concept as much as we like, but the fundamental idea is that you cannot achieve sustainability if you don't have sound governmental structures and principles in place within your organization.
I have one question for the audience, because I would like also to see more hands raised up. So you mentioned that the first checkpoint on the checklist is to have sustainability on the radar, right? To have it, to understand that it's important, and to have it in the planning for the next General Assembly to be maybe discussed. So how many organizers here, how many organizations here have the sustainability on the radar? Voilà, c'est pas mal.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, thank you very much.
But it's interesting how you actually interpret sustainability. It's in relation to the environment, fine. But how about the economic aspects or the social aspects, and equality in particular, equality and inequality? I can give the UK as an example. If you look at the current sports strategy in England, it has equality or inequality at the center, at the heart of developing sport. Because finally, after many years of talks and deliberations in the UK, we have admitted that if we don't tackle inequality, we're not going to achieve great progress in sport participation and the health outcomes that we are hoping to achieve. The same applies to running events. We're talking about the democratization of the running events, the mass participation, but again, it's an issue of opportunities, of access, and of equality. Absolutely fundamental issues.
And before we move to the final stage, when we would like to give the opportunity to people to maybe ask questions, from your experience, how long is the period from having something on the radar to actually signing up for the standard or applying the framework in the organizational processes?
This is a very individual question, and in relation to governance, for example, many governments, including the UK government, actually regulates this very heavily. In the UK, the deal is very simple. If you are a sport organization which receives public funding, you must, it's non-negotiable, you must subscribe to the Code of Good Governance, which includes some sustainable environmental dimensions. With respect to sustainability, I believe each organization needs to decide on their own what will be appropriate, how they interpret sustainability, how they would like to see themselves sustained and develop over time. And this is strictly contextual and individual. You cannot really mandate, you cannot tell organizations. And it's an issue of capacity. First and most of all, it's an issue of capacity. So we also need to ask ourselves how we use those running events in different shapes and forms in order to enhance capacity, individual, organizational, community capacity. A reference was made yesterday and the day before about social capital, which is at the heart of this discussion. It's about capacity.
And my question would be, can capacity be enhanced top-down, or it has to come bottom-up? But let's leave the opportunity to maybe our audience to ask the questions to the professor, or to join the coffee, if there are any.
Still waiting for the coffee. Chris.
Microphone is real and it's on the way.
He's got a mic. He's privileged. I believe he's gonna. Oh, he's okay.
It's Chris. You can see from here.
Thank you both of you. So Alessia and myself have been scrambling madly to get the coffee for you, but there's a delay. It'll be delivered when you come off the stage. Thanks for the great insights. Prof, I'm interested at the start, you spoke about London, and so many of those major events have a host city agreement. My sense is that very much in our industry, there's very few events that would have anything coming close to a host city agreement, and we're much more tenants is the term that I use rather than partners. So there's this kind of year-to-year thing where I renew the rent with the city by getting a permit, and we have this almost adversarial relationship, and I see it and I've experienced it myself in some places where we fight so hard to get our permit, and much of that comes from some of the discussion we had yesterday where event organizers don't come with this approach of what problem can we solve for the city. It's more, I've got a product to sell you, like Asahi was saying, I'm bringing my marathon, I'm bringing my triathlon to you, rather than this host city type of agreement that goes on an ongoing basis. Have you got any comments on that, or any examples of events that do? And maybe even Mike can comment. Obviously Chicago Marathon's got a great relationship with the city, but more of a formalized ongoing host city relationship than a year by year, I'm going to renew the lease, so to speak, as a tenant.
And maybe to build up on this, because you also work for Sochi, right?
Yeah.
So maybe if you can make a parallel, I mean, London, Sochi, Chicago.
Thank you for your question, Chris. Partnerships are notoriously difficult to establish and maintain, as we all know, because different parties will have different interests, and very often they scramble for the same resources. In relation to the London Games, there have been some success stories, and I'm afraid a lot of serious challenges and issues. And by the way, okay, I'm not going to mention this, but the official parlance that was adopted by the organizing committee at the time was that you cannot use the word issues, okay? It was only about challenges. You were only allowed to talk about challenges because they carry more positive connotations. Obviously, you aspire to overcome a challenge as opposed to you have to deal with issues. Sport was one of the, mass participation sport was one of the victims of the Olympic Games, I'm afraid. Because despite all the rhetoric and data and all the rest, if you look at what actually happened, a promise was made before the Games that no public funding for sport will be diverted to support the Games. And this is precisely what happened. £500 million of funding for community sport was actually spent on supporting the Games. And when the chair of Sport England, Derek Mapp, raised the question, yes, you have guessed it, he got fired. So that was not necessarily a great example of partnership, but the same applies to the legacy. There was a legacy board that was established with the view precisely to coordinate the efforts in order to deliver all of the promises. And guess what? In the space of 7-8 years, this board met only once. Only once. So they were unable to really come up with anything meaningful. But of course, they were successful partnership, particularly at local level. Local authorities with sport organizations in enticing and involving local population in different activities. Plenty of examples. Great examples of cooperation between universities, particularly Sheffield, for example, Sheffield Hallam with the organizing committee. We don't have time to go into details, but there were a number of very successful examples. The same with Sochi, by the way. And one of the legacy of the London Games, that's why I mentioned the Sheffield Hallam, they developed a program specifically for students becoming sport journalists. So they were able to extend this program as part of the knowledge transfer of the IOC program to Sochi and further on.
Thank you very much. We might have time if we want to hear from Chicago's experience, or if we want to pick up one more question. I guess
there is a hand there.
Okay, sorry. There is a hand. Sorry. So you can.
Can I just ask what you meant by life support? Can I ask what you meant by life support?
By life support?
Yes.
Yes, life support is about the ecosystem. It's about equality and equal opportunity. Yeah, this is what life support is about. And obviously children, we start with children. If you read different policy documents and literature, typically you will find ensuring sound and healthy childhood, and then equality and equal opportunities. And the ecosystem is part of the life support, the whole ecosystem. Yeah. Yes, please.
You said that you recommend us to sign the certificate ISO 2121.
Yeah.
Don't you mean that it's much better for every event organizer to see what they can do in their own environment to see what sustainability in their city and in their environment means than signing an ISO norm that maybe doesn't fit in every single aspect to their event?
You're absolutely right, but this is the industry standard and has been established since 2012, 10 years now. And the last time I checked, there were probably about 56 countries that have adopted or signed up to this standard. But you're absolutely right. Small events, they won't have the capacity. Besides, actually, purchasing the document, signing up for the document is pretty expensive in itself. So you really need to have the resources, once, and secondly, the capacity, to be able to deliver on all those different, so you can actually be certified as meeting the standards.
If I just speak for us as Mainova Frankfurt Marathon, we're doing, we're having our green event since 2004 and focus on sustainability long time ago, even if it wasn't on the agenda for other events. But for us, it's not affordable to sign an ISO certificate like that, so it doesn't make sense.
You don't need to do that. As long as you can demonstrate that what you're doing with regards to sustainability and the environment, and you can properly communicate that, I think that's perfectly fine. You don't necessarily need to have the badge of the ISO to say, okay, we are the most sustainable event.
But there's no badge or anything provided by like World Athletics or any other
there are
to show that there are sustainable events in the World Athletics family.
Well, again, I'm afraid, yes, you're asking for to put in place another, to institutionalize the process and to put in place another standard. And this is for the governing body to actually decide. And remember, again, okay, you will put in place this standard, but it needs to be administered and policed, which is, again, is a matter of resource.
We're going to Chicago, who also has something to, or not. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Just a second, because I raised the hand just in order to mention something, because I saw Alessio, and I think that especially for the elite and platinum label competitions, so let's say the superior level competitions, there should be some guidelines, because I know we come from different environments and different backgrounds, and we might not all in terms of race organizers or race owners understand all the aspects. But I give you an example. For us, when we switched to the elite label, we were somehow surprised, and we needed to understand how big is the gap that we need to cover in terms of, let's say, emergency medical conditions that the race needs to cover. It could be the same in terms of sustainability if the races that acquire a superior label will at least get some guidelines towards some aspects that they need to cover and solve in their approach of organizing the race. Then immediately that will become much more practical for us than going to a very bureaucratic and standardized process like ISO.
So that could be the last reflection. No, we can have just the last reflection from.
And I can mention that for Alessio as well. I think that's spot on, and I think there's some development that's taken place from World Athletics based on certain standards to be included when it comes to environmental sustainability. So to your point, I think it's going to be available. There's so many different associations as well. We work with the Council for Responsible Sport. We've reached the evergreen level and status, and there's other levels and status that you can't achieve. It does help in terms of signing up for some of these associations to give us those guidelines to be able to help us, one, to track and measure, and two, to make sure that we're following certain guidelines to help create that checklist per se. There's other different type of associations that can be more affordable and available to smaller organizations like us versus something at the level like the Olympics or World Championship that might have to subscribe by. And just real quick, and one final comment, when it comes to social integration and cohesion, those are things from our city and those relationships that we do. We ask those questions in terms of what are some of those challenges that our city has, and then how can we help support that, whether it's from an environmental standpoint, accessibility, education, and health. And so we all work together to see how our events can incorporate those to help come up with those solutions, the shared solutions through our events to meet their objectives as well.
Alessio, it will be your call if we keep people away from the real coffee, or?
Just 30 seconds to address Daniel's point. World Athletics has guidelines for race organizers now, and there are different levels of commitment based on the label.
Yeah.
So there is a different set of things you have to do based on the label you have.
I understood that at least while we were researching for that last year, they were not mandatory, but they will become rules that the competitions need to cover in terms of getting the label, isn't it?
Yes, that is correct. 23 is a pilot year, will be mandatory from 24. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as we heard, we have a lot of things that we can wrap up and put in a pocket when we go after this coffee. But is there a key word you want audience to take away from discussion?
Well, a key word. I mean, it's really hard to think about a single key word, but it's integrity. And I believe later today we'll talk about integrity. So as a person, as an organization, as a community, you need to have integrity. And if we relate this integrity to sustainability, for example, you need to demonstrate this integrity throughout everything you do.
My key takeaway is that even after success like London experience was, this can threaten mass participation sports. So sometimes we have to be careful how we apply sustainability across the industries. Thank you for the time, Professor. It was an honor.
Thank you.
And thanks, organizers, for this virtual coffee. Please join the real one.
So finally, we'll get the coffee, right?
Yes, finally. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.